Welcome to the Utility Security Podcast, your command center for all things utility security. From power plant warriors to grid guardians and even curious citizens, this podcast is your essential briefing on keeping up to date with knowledge and insights for securing our nation's utilities. Expert intel through interviews with security chiefs, tech wizards, and policy shapers. Tune in as we explore the latest vulnerabilities, industry best practices, and inspiring stories of resilience from the frontline heroes keeping our grids secure.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today, Andy. First, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Okay, Curtis, thank you for having me, and I'll try to keep it brief. My name is Andy Bochman, although sometimes I'm more formal, and I'm an Andrew. I am about to hit my 10-year anniversary with one of the nation's 17 national labs. This one's in Idaho called, unsurprisingly, the Idaho National Laboratory, where I am referred to as the Senior Grid Strategist in the National and Homeland Security Directorate. The word strategy, as I've interpreted it, and so far my seniors seem okay with this, is I go to whatever problem, whatever challenge seems to be the most pressing. And usually it's a future problem that other people haven't seen yet. So I live 5 to 10 years in the future. I look around from that vantage and then bring those notes back to inform folks that are supposed to be helping keep the grid going, doing new energy, whether it's nuclear, renewables, or other, and solving cybersecurity and physical security challenges, which all right now are extremely pressing.
Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to start off this article, and usually when I do an interview, I kind of lead in a specific way and have questions that kind of slowly build to the story here. But I wanted to go a little bit different this time and ask a very interesting question. Why is the concept of 500-year flood dead?
Right, I see what you did just there. We just went right at a thing without too much of a lead. The answer is that has always been a good way for us to describe probability when we're talking about risk management and we're talking about physical forces, weather to use a non-political term, extreme weather to get more specific and closer to the climate term. And in the past, by which I probably mean before the year 2000, in the past, referring to events, extreme events, by this 500-year or once in a century or once in a millennium type of format has meant to people that, well, if it's a 500-year flood, then or it's a 100-year flood, then there's one chance in 100 it's going to happen this year. And we can make our investments accordingly, investments in resilience or protections or insurance, right? This is really an insurance term as much as an engineering term. And when the weather patterns were more stable and more predictable, these things worked fine. No one would have brought it up. You could argue about what it is. Where is the level it is a 500-year flood? But once you had a general consensus on that, you could move on. The problem is, and I'll just use one example, but just please allow that there are many, is that in the mid to late teens of this century, Houston had 3 500-year floods in 3 consecutive years. If that's the case, what does that mean? What does that term even mean anymore? Well, the term comes from historical patterns. This is what we have seen in the past, and that's why we would characterize it as something that's that unlikely to happen. But the things that were unlikely to happen, floods, fire, freezes, heat domes, etc., are increasingly likely to happen. And I'll usually use the term, some people, if I'm getting pushback on even using the word climate or global warming, I'll say maybe we can agree that it's global weirding and that things are happening in places they didn't used to happen with a frequency or a ferocity that we never saw before. Things have changed. Others can debate why they're changing or who, if anybody's to blame for bringing this about. The fact is, though, if you just look around, And if you're an infrastructure defender like myself and many of my colleagues in the lab complex, Idaho and elsewhere, you can just feel it. It's hitting harder and faster and more frequently all the time. We probably need to use a different type of terminology to describe likelihood.
I love that global weirding. I'm gonna borrow that from you when I talk about this topic in the future. I think it's a great way of kind of taking some of the polarization out of the topic. And leading into my next question, this is a utility security audience we're talking to. They're looking at folks who steal copper. They're looking at extremist groups, cyber hackers from the big five countries who are out there trying to attack our systems. Climate weirdness should be on their radar, right? And can you tell our audience why this needs to be something they need to start planning for today?
All right, well, I'll tell you what. Thanks for setting it up that way, Curtis. First of all, let me say that many people in the audience, I don't know them personally, but I have a stereotype or picture of the typical person in your audience. Many people are aware of this. And of the people that have awareness, many of those people are taking action. They're part of vulnerability assessments. They're ingesting climate model data to give them a sense, not just looking backwards, but looking forwards to what's probably coming and by about when. If we just stick with heat, which is, I think, the easiest thing to understand, is that it's going to get hotter every year. And that heat does a number of different things. It's first of all, that heat is higher than it used to be. So whatever design decisions, design criteria were made in the past to size various equipment in substations and transformers, distribution and transmission lines, cooling systems for data centers, all of the stuff that's happening in the assets in a water treatment or wastewater treatment plant, all that stuff was designed for a different world. But my job as a utility guy, if I go back to just electricity, is to generate and or deliver energy that is reliable and to do it safely and affordably. And the heat in this one scenario is putting pressure on my mission to be able to do that. And I'm going to have to change some things from the way I used to do it. Just a couple examples would be, if it's getting hotter for longer than it used to be, that means my load is changing. That means people are going to be turning on air conditioners and keeping them on high longer than they used to. So I'm going to need to make and move more power. Or in places where there didn't even used to hardly be any heat. Recent examples, last few years, London and the Pacific Northwest, I don't even have air conditioners. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they hardly have air conditioning. And all of a sudden, it's 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the Pacific Northwest. Or it's 103 Fahrenheit in London. And they have air conditioning. Well, guess what they're buying now? And if I'm a utility person and I'm thinking about projecting my loads into the future, not even that far in the future, I know that I'm going to have to be making more. And that's just the air conditioning for the heat part. And that's just residential, not to include the effects on their commercial and industrial customers, not to include data centers, which are massive users of electricity, both to run the chips and to cool themselves. So there's just a million reasons. I'll just throw one more out there. Transmission lines and distribution lines become less efficient with heat. So I need to have more lines, or I won't be able to pump as much through to reach those customers on those days when they need it most, when it's really hot. That's an interesting weirdness, an interesting physics weirdness that has to be part of the calculus.
Okay. As you're talking about some of that stuff, you're talking about like heat waves. There's other things, floods, fire, freezes, fires, and things like that can all happen. But I think there's a lot more that goes along with climate events like this, or shifting in climate weirdness. I'll keep referring to that. Things like population displacement, global conflict rising when resources are suddenly moving because the weather is shifted and things like that. Can you talk more about the layers of the climate change onion and how they may impact security moving forward?
Yeah, well, I definitely heard in that the pointer to social disruption, chaos over scarce resources like water in some parts of the United States and certainly some parts of the world. Blackouts and brownouts, we're not used to those in the United States other than a few hours a year in most regions. The way the grid is configured right now, we're going to be having a lot more of those. And when we start to have longer and more frequent blackouts and brownouts, fingers are going to get pointed. We're in a democracy, but we're in definitely a combustible democracy these days. And we're going to try to figure out what's the cause of those things. And part of it is planning. Part of it is in attempting to reduce emissions and shutting down coal plants and limiting the number of gas plants while we build wind, solar, and storage. We've cut into our capacity too much. And so NERC, which I believe is a organization your listeners will be familiar with, every year now, both in the shoulder seasons and the fall, they're publishing winter warnings because there may not be enough gas and enough electricity to go around different parts of the country. And in the spring, they publish summer warnings for the same idea, that we don't have quite enough margin. We don't have the margin we used to have. And so be prepared to use less or to see it, to generate more, use less, and prepare for blackouts and brownouts. Try to be resilient. And when those things happen, that's going to potentially cause more disruption too, until we can iron out our differences and get on a better path in terms of energy planning and water planning.
So going back to our audience of security professionals, cyber and physical folks, how can they use their skills and knowledge they have today to start moving forward their security effectiveness in the future and having a plan that works?
I think you and I may have touched on this previously, the term defender DNA, the instinct to defend something that's valuable, whether it's yourself, your family, your community, the assets that your company uses and owns and runs. I think that impulse to protect, among many of the tribe from which I emerged and still am a member of, the cybersecurity people, they're very focused on their particular niche or sub-niche of the whole infrastructure cybersecurity, or OT cyber, or industrial control system cyber problem. And one thing I'll say to them, as you've heard in the past, is I request or recommend or ask them to open the aperture a little bit and think that they know how to do information sharing. They know the information sharing and analysis centers. They know how to swim in federal regulatory and state regulatory waters. And that if the threat for threats that are not cyber in origin, like digital origin, but they could be physical. And I do the sleight of hand a little bit to say that physical climate risks are physical risks. So everybody that's in a physical security position has a new foe to understand and then to begin to take up arms against, to begin to protect against. It's clearly physical. It's not digital. There's no intelligent adversary, but it's pounding, it's pounding on your assets in various ways. And we don't want to be flat-footed about that, do we? So yeah, I'm sometimes publishing now in physical security magazines or speaking as a keynote at a physical security conference. And I'm not talking about gates, guards, and guns. I'm talking about something else for which gates, guards, and guns provide no relief.
You kind of touched on some nexus points between the physical climate change things that happen and some of the OT cyber stuff. I don't know if there's some other areas you want to drill into where those two kind of come together, and where cyber folks should be focusing in on making an impact.
Well, I think the cyber people, at least several in the circles that either I swim in or that circle around my territory, they're really focused these days on, wow, we're deploying so much renewables, so many renewables, wind and solar and storage, and some of the EVs and EV infrastructure too. And one way of describing some of those components is they are inverter-based resources. And one way to talk about inverters is to say the inverter digital controllers, they're all from China. This makes us uneasy in the United States. And there really is no good answer to this because the current administration has done so much to encourage the rapid deployment of wind and solar and storage and EVs. It's happening, and it's going to keep happening for a little while, a few years in the future, right? And when that happens, renewables will become a larger percentage of generation. And because they'll become a larger percentage generation, we'll be more dependent on them being reliable. And because of that, we'll be in a precarious position, assuming that the supplier, the origin of supplier being in China, gives potential adversaries an upper hand. We need to get real smart, real fast on how we build. I think cyber people are pretty good at this, right? Because people will be familiar with the term insecure by design from Dale Peterson's world. They are prompted to build security in, design it in, as opposed to bolt it on. I think we're going to be bolting on a lot more when it comes to the renewables that are getting put in the field today. Like I said, it's not the ideal way to do it. It's not the most cost-effective way to do it. But when it comes to that particular risk vector, that's what we're starting to do and need to keep doing.
Very insightful. Very insightful. Last question. Any other words of advice you could kind of speak directly to our utility security folks, and also provide them some information how they can get in touch with you if they want to chat more about climate change and what they can do to better improve security? Sure.
And again, I appreciate it. I guess if it's to cyber and physical people, it would be to urge, as I have in the past, that they get to know each other better, because many times they don't know each other, and they have a lot to share. There's a lot of things. As the physical side becomes more digitally oriented and digitally dependent, they obviously are part of the cyber landscape at that point, the cybersecurity landscape. And to the OT cyber people, cyber physical people, we have these different synonyms, right? As much as climate is a physical risk, then this is something for them to take seriously, because they put all their attention into making the particular asset or a critical function as secure as possible. There's no perfectly secure thing. And that asset or that function gets whacked by a bad actor physically or climate, global weirding, then they really haven't done their job. It's like an anecdote that I told at one of those Dale Peterson S4 conferences, which was, and I'll try to do it in short strokes, was talking to folks, this is via the State Department. They were operating a hydro plant in Uganda, and they had just bought some Huawei equipment, and they knew, or they had read, that might be not so great from a cybersecurity point of view. So via the State Department, they found this guy that translates general cyber concepts, and gave them some best practices, things to think about to protect themselves, better insulate themselves from whatever badness might be in the Huawei stuff that they bought. It wasn't their decision to buy it. And so we went through those things, and we shared training ideas and future resources they could turn on. And at the end of that conversation, I said, this is really fun. I wasn't there in Uganda, it was remote. But at the end of that, I said, we can stay in touch if you like, or before we hang up, are there any other issues you want to say, something you want to let me know about? And they said, yeah, the Nile's drying up. And that for me was the slap in the face. Like, okay, so we just talked about cyber for an hour and a half. Yeah. There's a hydro plant. Its job is to power a big chunk of the country with formerly reliable, huge amounts of water that are starting to turn into a drip. And it doesn't matter how secure or insecure their digital assets are in that. If I only focus on the cyber part, that'd be blindsided when they wake up and nothing comes out and no turbines turn and there's no electricity. So I think everybody, no matter what walk of life they're in or what their mission is, security or otherwise, has to be now more of an all hazards person than whatever the niche was that they were focused on before.
Wow. Yeah, definitely a lot to combat as we move into the years to come. And yeah, hopefully that defender DNA that our listeners have, I know with them having that, they'll find ways to rise to the occasion. But yeah, the new threats are there and continuing to grow. And I want to thank you so much for your time today, Andy.
Oh, Curtis, thank you for asking such great questions. I think you said in the previous question, any resources or how to get in touch. I'll just do a quick riff on that. Again, I'm at Idaho National Lab. My email, I think you can put it in the notes, but it's andrew.bochman@inl.gov. Okay. I'm also very active on LinkedIn and easy to find there. The lab that I'm in is it's one of the 3 applied engineering labs, which is different than the other science and tech ones, which are more out in the far future. Ours is, its job is to solve the critical problems, the most pressing grand challenges of today and tomorrow, not of 20 years in the future. So that's what's happening, my colleagues at Idaho, on designing and developing and testing small modular and micro reactors, making sure that that's done with security in mind up front, designed in from the beginning. And by the way, I also mentioned climate resilience to my SMR counterparts. Like, is this thing you're designing, are you using just historical temperature data for the region that it's going to be located in? Or are you factoring in are you putting in a safety factor of an additional 10 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit so that it'll be reliable? Because we're going to need it. If we're going to take all the time to design and build and certify it and put it in the field, we're going to need it. So it's going to be able to operate in tougher temperature regimes. Some conferences I think that might be beneficial for some of your listeners, viewers, readers would be one that just happened, Battelle's Innovation in Climate Resilience, which happens every year. It just happened in DC and it'll come around again in April. Innovations in Climate Resilience. We have some national labs and some utility people there. The National Adaptation Forum is in Minneapolis next week. So that's more about adapting processes to be reliable in the new world that we are in and entering into. And maybe one more I'll say is one's actually called Resilient Week. And that is a lot of cyber, a lot of grid, a lot of industrial control system aspects in addition to climate. And that comes up later this year, again in Washington, D.C., just called Resilient Week. So I'll stop there. They know how to reach me, and I'm giving you some places that these folks might want to go. Maybe we'll meet there someday.
Fantastic resources. Thanks so much for sharing those, Andy. And to our audience out there, stay safe and stay secure.
Don't forget to visit our website at utilitysecurity.com for exclusive intel, resources, and a community of fellow utility security professionals. Stay safe, stay informed, and stay tuned for your next mission briefing.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Utility Business Media and its employees. It is strongly recommended that you discuss any actions or policy changes with your company manager